Now it's time for our speaker. We have a special guest, Medina County Treasurer. Doesn't look like a county treasurer, John Burke. He's here to portray a Delaware Indian known as Captain Wolfe, who lived 200 years ago in his village along Chippewa Lake. Treasurer Burke has been involved with Indian lore since he was in the Order of the Arrow as an Eagle Scout. He has made his regalia using the same materials as the Indians, duplicating authentic pieces from museums. John is a lifelong resident of Medina County, where his ancestry dates to the first pioneers, Valley City. He has been Medina County Treasurer since 1994. There are two parts to our program. First, Captain Wolfe of the Delaware will come and speak to us about his life and time. In the second part, John Burke will step out of character and tell us more about the woodland Indians and answer questions. Now, let us prepare our minds and go back to a different era. It is after the War of 1812, and the last of the Delaware Indians are preparing to leave their homes in this area and move further west, away from the white settlers in the Ohio country. Now let's hear the words of Captain Wolfe.
Listen, brothers and sisters. In the past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were one with it. A time when only the red children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires. A time when the forest grew as thick as the fur of the winter bear, and the streams ran cold as the freshly fallen snow. A time when a warrior could hunt and eat as much as he needed, and walk from horizon to horizon without ever seeing another human being. It was in this time of simple ways that we knew in our hearts the conflict that was to come. And whether for good or bad, we knew only one thing certain. There would be much change to our way of life. I'm a Delaware Indian. We call ourselves Lenape. It means the original people, because long ago we lived far from this Ohio country along the great water you call the Atlantic. And then the Chamonix came, the whites, and they moved us west and pushed us further west until we came to this Ohio country. It was my grandfather who first lived in the Ohio country, and it was in the year of 1755 that he went with many of his Lenape brothers to join with other tribes, the Ottawa, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Kickapoo, the Miami, all joined together to go to a place called Fort Duquesne, in the town you now call Pittsburgh. Here they would join the French and fight the British in the French and Indian War. It was on a warm summer day that they met in battle. Then the woods were very thick and there were no roads. So the British under General Braddock with 2,400 redcoats had to cut a path through the woods and cut the trees down to make a road. But on this day, they went from the forest into a meadow. And as they marched through this clearing, this is when my grandfather and the Indians and the French attacked them. They hid in the woods behind the branches and trees and rocks. The redcoats were in the middle of the field, shoulder to shoulder, holding their guns in front with long knives. My grandfather said they shot them down like pigeons. They would have killed them all that day except for the bravery of one young colonel. This colonel fought under General Braddock, and his militia men formed a rear guard so the redcoats could get away. We thought this man must have the Great Spirit on his side because 3 horses were shot out from under him that day, and 8 bullets went through his clothing and hat, and yet he was never wounded. You may know the name of this young colonel who fought so bravely with the British that day. for his name was George Washington. Now, there were many prisoners taken, and my grandfather, with a group of 12 Seneca and Cayuga Indians, took them on a journey close to here. They went to the river called Maumee, and then north to the Fort Detroit. Here they would sell the prisoners back to the British, and with the money they received, they would buy black powder and lead for bullets, and flintlock guns, things they could not make. On this journey, they decided that they would not sell one man back. Instead, when they came to Fort Detroit, this man's name was Jim Smith. He was 17 years old and had been an axeman cutting the trees for the road that Braddock built. They did not sell him back, and instead dressed him as an Indian and adopted him and gave him an Indian name of Sawoya. On the return visit, they came again to the east. The first winter they went to the falls on the Black River and camped and hunted and took skins. The next, they went down the east tributary of the Rocky River, and that winter they decided to stay at a place called Panther Cave. You see, they called it Panther Cave because of the many mountain lions and bobcat that lived in this area. These were the skins, the cat skins that the Erie Indians wore for clothing. Yes, the one the lake is named after. Erie means cat nation. And they wore the skins of the cats. They hunted bear and deer and took many skins. These they would trade in the spring at Fort Sandusky. They hunted raccoon. There were many raccoon then. Do you have many raccoon today? Yes? But we fix our raccoon in a special way. We have our women stuff it like you stuff your turkey at Thanksgiving. And then we roast it, and we cut it into small pieces, and then we dip it in something special before we eat it. You see, we had no salt and pepper and seasonings until the traders brought us these things. But we did have one thing we love to put on our food: maple sugar and syrup. It makes the raccoon taste very good. The French lost that war, and with it they made a treaty with the British. And they said all the land belonged now to the British. We did not understand this. We thought the land was given by the great Creator for all to use and hunt upon. Shortly after the war, there was another great chief, Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe, who joined all the Indian tribes in Confederation. He did not like the fact that the French had gone away, and so he continued the war, and with all the tribes joined together, we attacked all the forts in the Midwest. We took all 12 forts, except we could not take Fort Niagara and Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit. It was only 1 year after this that Colonel Burke came with an army of 1,500 men, and he came from up the Muskingum to the Tuscarawas River. He burned all the villages that he found along the way. We sued for peace with this Colonel Burke. We could not fight an army of 1,500 men. And with that peace treaty, he said we must return all white captives, even those adopted by our Delaware tribe. All the tribes must do this. So within 12 moons, we brought 300 white captives back to Colonel Burke. Oh, it was a sad day, because many of these were adopted. They were our families. But we gave them back as a sign of peace. This helped for some time. But In 1774, Lord Dunmore sent his Virginians, the Long Knives, in the same path, up the Muskingum, up the Tuscaroras. We had many Delaware villages along the rivers here, and they burned the villages and all our crops. There was a battle called Pleasant Valley. Here, Colonel Lewis lost 200 men to the warriors under Cornstalk. Again, we had many Indians from many tribes, but we did not have enough black powder and lead bullets to finish the battle. We had to leave 45 of our warriors on the field. Cornstalk decided he would make peace again with Lord Dunmore and the Virginians. And it was shortly after this that the Treaty of Stanwix was signed. This said that all the land east of the Ohio and south would be given to the Long Knives and British to settle. But the Ohio country was to be the Indians. Not long after this, the white men brought and built their cabins across the river in the Ohio country. And we had a chief who went to Fort Randall with his son, Red Hawk, and they sued for terms to make the white men leave the Ohio country. Instead, they were killed at the fort. This turned many of us against the whites. And then we learned that the new 13 fires, or colonies as you call it, were at war with their English father. We did not want any part of this war. 3 times they met with us and the other tribes and wanted us to take up the hatchet. And all 3 times the Lenape said, "We will not fight." The Revolutionary War was one my father fought in. And we finally had to fight and pick sides. We had Captain Pipe, who wanted us to fight with the British. In his clan, there were 3 Delaware clans, the Wolfe, the Turtle, and the Turkey family clans. We split, and Captain Wolfe and his clan fought with the British. Captain White Eyes and Captain Kilbuck, our other chiefs of the other clans, fought with the Long Knives, the Americans. I remember it was the first time the Americans built a fort in the Ohio country. It was in 1778, and a general called McIntosh came from Fort Pitt. He came up the Yellow Creek. He built a fort, Fort McIntosh, as a supply fort. And then he went on. He went to a place that used to be a great village of the Delaware. It was called, we called it Tuscaroras. It had been abandoned, but this is where he chose to build a fort. Fort Lawrence is what they called it. This is near the town you now have called Bolivar. Here they sent 200 men, and they went in the fort. They had 1 cannon in the fort. We could not fight the cannon. But the next winter, Simon Girty and 50 regular British soldiers came with the Wyandots and the Delaware, and they laid siege on the fort. You see, we only had 200 men. And my father said, even though there were only 200, they played a trick on this Fort Lawrence. They painted all the Indians with war paint, and they took the British soldiers and they went in front of the fort, just out of the range of the flintlock guns and the cannon. And they marched in front of the fort and then went behind the woods where they could not be seen, and came back and went in front of the fort again. They kept counting our men. They thought we had 1,000. We lay siege on it and did not let any supplies come into the fort, and soon they were eating their own moccasins. They were so hungry. We killed a group of 17 men who came out of the fort trying to escape and get wood and food. But then a relief column came from Fort Pitt, and we had to abandon it. 500 soldiers from Fort Pitt we could not fight. But soon after this, Fort Lawrence was abandoned, and not much longer the Revolutionary War ended. And those who had sided with the British once again found themselves on the losing side, and this time all the land, including the Ohio country, was now to belong to the Long Knives, the 13 Fires of the United States. We did not participate in this treaty. We did not sign the talking papers. So the war went on in the Ohio country for many years. Again, many of the Lenape decided they would try to stay out of the war, but soon there was atrocities, such as the one in Ganotgahunt. Here, many of the Delaware had been talked to by the Black Robes and had become Christians, and even this village had been taken aside, and a militia group had come there and killed all the men, women, and children. This turned many of us against the Long Knives, and the war continued in the Ohio country. They sent two armies then against us. 1790 and 1791, it was General Hamar and General St. Clair. These were generals who were in the Revolutionary War. They took their armies and started at Camp Washington, which was now, I think, the city they call Cincinnati. And they moved north, destroying all the villages they came to. But each of these armies, we had collected all the Indian tribes together under the leadership of Shawnee Blue Jacket and Miami Chief Little Turtle. We ambushed them at night. It is called the Night of 1,000 Slain against St. Clair, for this is how many we killed and wounded and took prisoner. And then there was peace for several years. But then they sent a third general, General Anthony Wayne. We called him the general who never sleeps, because we could not ambush him at night. Each night he formed a square and fortification, so we could not attack him. There was a large battle called Fallen Timbers, and here we could not fight against the cannon he brought and the cavalry. He won the battle, and then the general told us, within 12 moons, all the chiefs of all the tribes must come and sign another treaty. This was the Greenville Treaty. And this gave most of the Ohio country to the Long Knives. There was to be a part just for the Indians, and all our chiefs made their marks on the talking papers. It was bordered by the Cuyahoga River down to the Tuscaroras, near the town you now call Akron. And here it went west to the Indiana Territory. This northwest corner of the Ohio country was to be the Indians as long as the grass grew and the skies were blue. And yet the ink was not yet dry on the talking papers, and the white men came and built their cabins there also. This is what led to the War of 1812. This is the war I fought in. In that war, I fought with the Long Knives under General William Henry Harrison, who later became the Great White Father, or President of the United States, as you call it. I remember I served as a captain of the Scouts, and for that service, I received a medal with the general's image on it. I was an eyewitness to the Battle of Lake Erie, when in September of 1813, Commodore Perry beat the British fleet in Sandusky Bay. After this, the British had no boats on Lake Erie. They could not supply their troops, and Fort Meigs under the Americans was able to hold off British invasion. I remember a general who came from Fort Pitt with the American Army. He brought with him 6 brass cannon, and much like Braddock years before, had to cut a path through the woods to move his army. On the way, he was afraid of being attacked by the British, who he had learned that they had landed at Huron with their Indian allies. But this was not true. You see, the men who had landed at Huron were not British. They were American prisoners. General Hull, the American general at Fort Pitt, had surrendered Fort Pitt. Our great leader, Tecumseh, of the Indian tribes, and the British General Burke had tricked them, much like we did at Fort Lawrence years before. They marched their army of 800 men around and around the fort. They thought they had many thousand. So General Hull had surrendered Fort Detroit, 2,000 men, without firing a shot. This general that moved through this area and brought his 6 brass cannon, he did not know this, and he thought they were coming south, the British and the Indians. So he buried his cannon in the ground and covered them up. And he never came back for them. To this day, I do not think they found those cannon, and his road is named after the general. It is called Smith Road, and it goes much through Medina County, near Akron also, I believe. In the winter, we lived in longhouses, much like your log cabins. Large logs, 30 to 40 feet wide, 100 to 150 feet long. This would house 20, 25 families. Holes in the roof for each family would allow the cooking fire smoke to go through. We also had wigwams. These were much smaller, 8 to 10 feet in diameter, 4 or 5 feet high. We used willow branches. They were easy to bend, and we tied them together and stuck the ends in the ground. Over the skeletal frame, we would strip off large pieces of bark or make reed mats and cover the frame. These were easy to make and move, and we used them for our hunting camps. I remember my last one. It was in the year of 1822, and we shared 14 such wigwams with the Wyandots along the Chippewa Lake. We hunted, we fished in the lake, we caught turtle, we hunted and trapped beaver. The beaver is the skin that brought the most money at the trading post. It is what the whites wanted the most. And so we brought many beaver that we trapped to the whites. I'm told they make top hats from these skins. And the whites must not have many hats because we brought many skins. I hear they even sent skins over to the other side of the Atlantic for the whites over there. I assume they must not have hats either. We hunted bear, we hunted deer, we hunted buffalo, yes, here in the woods. The buffalo would come in large herds, nose to tail, and go through the trees. The forest then had much bigger trees than I see today. Trunks this big around, 150 to 200 feet tall. There was little brush to go through, and it was clear passage for the buffalo, but they would follow the same path every time they would move through the forest. Over the years, their sharp hoofs would dig deep paths. These we used as our trails and our war trails and our game trails. Sometimes the banks on the side were 6 to 8 feet tall. When the Chamonix came, the whites, they widened these and made them into roads for their wagons. I see today you have such game trails are now your roads also. One such buffalo path I talk about, you now have a number on it. It's 44 and 2, I do not know what that means. Another war trail, which also was the great trail from Fort Pitt to the fort called Sandusky. This is close to here, and it has a number on it of 3 and 0. Do not know what that means either. There was one animal we did not hunt, and that was the wolf. You see, we considered the wolf a messenger from the Great Spirit, so we did not hunt the wolf. And when the pioneers came here and built their cabins, wolves were many in number and they would kill their sheep and calves. So to get rid of the wolves, they put a very high bounty on a wolf skin, $15. This was much money then. A doe skin or female deer skin would bring 50 cents at the trading post, and that of a large buck would bring $1. You know, that's why you whites call $1 a buck. It was $1 for one buckskin in trade. After the war, we lived in peace with the whites for many years, but we were careful. When we came near their cabin, they saw us. We took our tomahawk from our sash, and we would strike it into a tree. And then we would hold our hand up to show we had no weapon. I do that to you today to show you I come as a friend. Now let me step out of the character of Captain Wolfe, and we'll continue our discussion about woodland Indians. All those things I told you about Captain Wolfe, those are all true. I researched him in the old pioneer records and some of the church records in Medina County. And the last time we know of Captain Wolfe in the area of Chippewa Lake, which is in the middle of Medina County, maybe some of you older people would remember even Chippewa Lake Park. I went there when I was a kid. And this was his hunting ground, and this was his last camp in 1822. He had 14 wigwams with the Wyandottes, and what happened that year was the white settlers in the area decided that the Indians were killing too many deer, so they paid a visit to Captain Wolfe. They took 17 men with their flintlocks. When they came to his village, there was no one there because he was out hunting, but they decided to leave him a message. They stripped some birch bark off of the tree, and they drew a picture of an Indian with the charcoal from his fire on the bark. And then they all took their guns and they shot holes in it. And they propped that up on his wigwam. Well, when he comes back, of course, what does he think? He thinks he's going to be next. They're going to shoot him. So about 6 months later in the records, I find a reference to a wolf tribe. There were no wolf Indians, but that was probably his Lenape clan, his wolf clan of Lenape. And they're about 6 miles west of Lodi at that point. After that, I couldn't find any records of what happened to Captain Wolfe. So we really don't know what happened to him, but we know the Lenape, or the Delaware Indians, are some of the last Indians to leave Ohio in about 1840. From here they go to Kansas and Missouri, and after treaties there are broken, they end up in Indian Territory in Oklahoma, and that's where the reservation is today. So, let me go through a couple of these things real quick that I brought with me, and I'll take some question and answers. But the first thing is, well, let's talk about the way I'm dressed. I'm dressed like an Indian would have been dressed back in the 1700s, early 1800s. And the first thing you probably notice is my headdress. And when you think of Indians, you probably think of the image I grew up with as a kid. We see it on TV all the time. The headdresses are eagle feather war bonnets. Well, those are worn by the Western Indians out in the plains. But this is a Gastoa, and this is a woodland headdress. So they used all sorts of feathers in their Gastoas. Hawk, eagle, owl. They'd even go to the traders and get birds that were not native to North America. They'd get peacock feathers and pheasant feathers. And this Gastoa I rebuilt from a museum copy at the Smithsonian, and this one has over 100 feathers in it. You'll also notice I have a linen shirt on. Of course, the Indians couldn't make cloth, but they traded for that because they were cooler. They liked the colorful shirts. Before that, and even during that period, they still made much of their clothing out of leather. And so my leggings and my moccasins are made out of deer skin from a deer I shot. The other thing you'll notice is I have a sash instead of a belt. This is a 1970 or 1795 chevron French pattern. It was made on a loom, an old antique loom, just like they made them. And often they would put a knife or a tomahawk in their sash on their back. Another thing, every Indian had, men and women, was a neck knife in the woods. This was a woodland trait. They had all carried a neck knife like this. Now this one is steel, and I put it on a fox jaw. They would have gotten a steel blade from the traders, and then this becomes my camp knife for cooking meat, or cutting meat and doing things in camp. The other thing I want you to notice is the decoration of my sheath, my knife sheath. This is the same as I have on my brow piece of my headdress. I also have it on my hunting pouch and a little bit on my moccasins. Anybody want to tell me what that is? This is the way they decorated all their clothing before the beads were brought to them by the traders. Anybody want to guess? Porcupine quills. Only in North America do we have this artistry of porcupine quill work. You'll see it in the museums. There's very few of us that do it anymore. The Indians didn't kill the porcupine. What they would do is they're pretty slow, and so when they saw one, they would throw a blanket over it and yank the blanket off, and the quills would catch. There's a hook on them, and they would pull off. And the porcupine grows new ones. They take these and they soak them. This is a large one, but they're smaller ones. And they would soak them, make them soft, and then they would flatten them with a bone and then dye them with natural things like blueberries, cherries, green for moss green. And then they would stitch them into these wonderful patterns. So that's the way they decorated all their clothing in the old days. So this is a hunting bag. Every hunter would take this with him, and what do you think they carry in their hunting bag?
Lead balls.
Yes, lead balls, right.
Powder.
And their powder, is in their powder horn. Black powder's in the powder horn. And then, did I hear a why? Oh, okay. Well, let me explain flintlock guns. How many black powder shooters do we have? I could tell I had some here. Okay. Well, you guys know this, but I'll walk you through what it takes to shoot a black powder gun. Can you hear me if I talk like this?
Yes.
Okay, because it's a little hard to demonstrate and hold the mic. This is a flintlock gun. It's a 60 caliber French make gun, and the way you would load this is you would first take black powder out of your powder horn, and you'd measure. You might have a tip of an antler, so you'd get the same amount of powder every time. But you'd put black powder in this barrel, and then you'd have a little patch of cloth, and you'd have a round lead ball. And that's so tight that it really doesn't fall down the barrel. You've got to take your ramrod, and you've got to push all that down the barrel to the bottom. Okay? Now, the way this fires is, that's why we call it a flintlock. Now, this is not like the guns we have today when you have a bullet and you insert it and you shoot it. So, my powder is down in here now, but the flint piece is right here in this hammer. So you cock this hammer back and there's a piece of flint. That flint's going to hit this steel frizzle right here. And what happens when we hit flint with steel? Where's my scout leaders? Sparks, right. So, but there's one thing more we have to do. We have to take a little powder and we have to put it in the flash pan right there. So when it sparks, it catches that on fire. And then there's a little hole, you can't see it, but it's in my barrel. That shoots into there. The powder that we put down with the bullet ignites and it shoots the bullet out. So that's the way these work. Now, if I had powder in there, you'd see this big puff of smoke. Unless my powder was wet. And then you get nothing, and that's where the expression flash in the pan comes from. Oh, it's just a flash in the pan, and you hope that didn't happen when you had a bear coming at you or an enemy, you know. But anyway, so if you're really good, yes.
What about lock, stock, and barrel?
Yeah, he just brought up lock, stock, and barrel. Now this is not a standard gun. The brown vest that was used in the Revolutionary War, those were standard guns. They were made with the same metalwork, hammers, everything was standard so that if you needed to repair it, you could use the same part. That's where we get lock, stock, and barrel from. That's what you wanted, is something you could repair easily. This was a custom-made one, so you'd have to take this to a gunsmith probably. And that's what the Indians didn't have, were gunsmiths. So they were always going to find gunsmiths from the whites and also blacksmiths who would make metal things for them. But anyways, so you saw how long, all the steps it takes to shoot this gun. If you're really good, how many times can you load and shoot one off in a minute? And he's right, 3. 3 if you're really good, about 20 seconds apiece. Now, let me ask you this. You got a bow and arrow, you got a quiver of arrows, and you're pulling those arrows out, and you're shooting them in your bow. How many times can I do that in a minute?
20.
Yeah, that's a pretty good guess, 20, but